No one in the glass towers along the river ever suspected that the woman with the flowered thermos and the cardigan 2 sizes too big for hiding was the only person standing between an empire and its own rot. Bullets and bribes ran this city. Everyone knew that. What nobody counted on was a spreadsheet. The 40th floor of Ashcombe at Pierce hummed with the particular exhaustion of late-stage capitalism, recycled air, cold coffee, and the low blue static of 100 monitors nobody was really looking at anymore. Maren Doyle was looking at hers. She had been looking at it for 11 hours. She was 27, 5'5", and, depending on who in the office you asked, either the numbers girl or the big one in compliance. She had stopped correcting people a long time ago. It didn't matter how many CFA modules she'd passed, or how many times she'd single-handedly caught an error that saved the firm $3 million. To most of Ashcombe and Pierce, Maren was a body first and a mind a distant second. Maren had learned a long time ago that the world sorted people into categories before it ever bothered to ask what they could do. At 5'5" and a size the fashion magazines in the break room pretended didn't exist, she had spent 27 years being sorted first and heard second. She dressed to disappear. Loose cardigans in shades of nothing, her thick, dark hair scraped back into a bun so severe it gave her headaches by noon, and it had never once worked. The world found a way to notice her body even when she gave it nothing to look at. Still here? Genevieve Cole leaned against the frame of Maren's cubicle the way she leaned against everything. Like ownership was a physical stance. Genevieve ran client relations, which mostly meant lunches, and she had a gift for delivering insults wrapped in concern. Her eyes dropped, with theatrical pity, to the granola bar sitting on Maren's desk. You know, for someone who spends all day sitting, you really don't need the extra snack. Maren's face went hot, the old reflex, the one she hated herself for. It's dinner, Genevieve. I'm working through the Holloway file. Of course you are. Genevieve smiled the smile of someone who had never once eaten dinner at her desk. Some of us have the Pierce anniversary gala tonight. Not that you'd come. She said it like a kindness. It never was. Oh, Desmond wants the Casterbridge reconciliation signed off by morning. Don't fall asleep on us. When the perfume trail faded, Maren let out the breath she'd been holding since the sentence began. She was a senior compliance auditor with a master's from Wharton, and she made 60 cents on every dollar her male peers made for doing work none of them could actually do. She had never once been invited to a client dinner. She didn't fit the room, as Desmond Ashcombe had put it once, not unkindly, which had somehow made it worse. She had been the one who caught the Holloway discrepancy last spring, the one who found the double-book derivatives position that would have cost the firm its biggest account, the one whose name never once appeared in the memo Desmond sent to the partners taking credit for it. She had stopped expecting credit years ago. What she hadn't stopped expecting, foolishly, was to be left alone to do her job in peace. That, apparently, was still too much to ask. She pushed the granola bar aside and pulled up the Casterbridge file. It was supposed to be nothing. Desmond had told her himself. An old account, legacy paperwork. A shell entity called Casterbridge Holdings quietly moving funds to a hospitality group in Tampa. Rubber stamp it, he'd said. Maren's brain had never once been able to rubber stamp anything in her life. By a quarter to midnight, with the floor entirely empty, she found it, a hairline fracture in a currency conversion fee, routed through a clearing bank in Nicosia that had no earthly reason to be involved in Tampa hospitality. She followed it the way she always did, patiently, one thread at a time, using a script she'd built herself in grad school to flag routing anomalies across custodial ledgers. The thread became a rope. The rope became a noose. Casterbridge wasn't hospitality. It was a wash cycle. Cash from parking garages, vending routes, and 2 waste management companies, laundered through structured trades and dropped clean into accounts in Malta and the Caymans. 4 years of it, tens of millions, and buried in the metadata of an invoice PDF, a name that made her stomach drop through the floor. Vane. Everyone in this city knew the Vanes. Not street muscle, a syndicate with judges and union locals and half the zoning board in its pocket. And Desmond Ashcombe, her prim, superior boss, was personally signing off on laundering their money. Worse, the recent transfers were sloppy. Millions were splitting off into a second, hidden sub-account, and the credentials on that sub-account belonged to Desmond himself. Desmond was skimming from the Vanes. Maren's hands started shaking before her brain had even finished the thought. If the Vanes found out what Desmond was doing, he was dead. If Desmond found out she'd seen it, she was dead. There was no safe door out of this room. She plugged in the little encrypted drive she kept on her keyring and started copying everything. Her fingers slick with sweat, mistyping twice. The progress bar crawled toward 99% when the elevator chimed. She yanked the drive, shoved it into her bra, and had a spreadsheet of nothing pulled up on screen by the time Desmond rounded the corner. Tie loose, smelling like good scotch and bad decisions. Doyle. His eyes narrowed. What are you still doing here? You asked for the Casterbridge sign-off by morning. Did you finish it? Balanced clean, she said, and hated how steady her own voice sounded, because inside she was screaming. Routine transfer. He studied her for one long, suffocating second. Then he smiled his greasy smile. Good girl. Go home. She didn't run until she hit the stairwell. By Tuesday morning, the 40th floor had the wrong kind of quiet. Not the productive hush of people working, but the flinching stillness of people afraid to be noticed. Maren sat at her desk nursing a headache born of zero sleep, having spent the night deciding between three bad options: run, call the FBI, or pretend she'd seen nothing. At 10, four men in dark tailored suits stepped off the private elevator, moving with the unhurried precision of people who had never once had to hurry for anything. Behind them came a man who seemed to pull all the air out of the room. Julian Vane. 35. He didn't look like the head of a crime family. He looked like the kind of CEO who terrified boardrooms without raising his voice. Dark suit, dark eyes, a stillness that felt like a held breath before a shot. Every conversation in the bullpen died the second he crossed the threshold. Desmond nearly fell out of his own office. Mr. Vane, we weren't expecting. Clearly, Julian's voice was low and even, the kind of calm that was worse than shouting. There's a $4.1 million hole in a ledger with your name on it, Desmond. My people tell me your systems are leaking. A glitch, surely. I can assure you every dollar is. I don't deal in glitches. Julian's gaze swept the floor and landed, without hurry, on Maren. Bring me whoever ran the Casterbridge file. Maren felt the floor tilt. Desmond's panicked eyes found her a half-second later, and she understood immediately. He was going to feed her to this man. Doyle. Desmond's voice cracked. Get in here. Bring the file. Every head in the office turned, and Yves actually smirked, clearly assuming Maren was about to be fired for incompetence in front of an important client. Maren stood, gathered the folders with hands that would not stop shaking, and walked into the glass conference room like she was walking into her own execution. The four men in dark suits didn't so much as glance at her as she passed, their attention fixed on the doors and windows with the flat professional patience of people paid to notice threats, not people. It was Julian's stillness that unsettled her most. He wasn't scanning the room for danger. He was simply waiting, the way a held breath waits, for whatever came through that door next. Julian Vane didn't look past her the way handsome men usually did, with that practiced, polite dismissal. He looked at her, the flush climbing her throat, the folders clutched to her chest, the sweater she used like armor, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not disgust, not tolerance, attention. Total, unblinking attention. This is Doyle, Desmond said quickly, already arranging his sacrifice. Junior auditor. If there's an error, Mr. Vane, it's hers. I'll terminate her within the hour. Something hot cut through Maren's fear. Senior auditor, she corrected, voice shaking but clear. And there's no error in my reconciliation. Watch your mouth, Maren. Julian raised one hand. The room went dead silent. He crossed to stand in front of her, close enough that she had to tip her head back. You said there's no mistake, he said quietly. No, sir. The ledger balances on the surface. But the routing codes on the offshore clearing leg have been hand-altered. The money didn't disappear. It was diverted. Desmond made a strangled sound. She's lying. She doesn't understand what she's nobody, Julian. Look at her. Julian moved before the sentence finished. He had Desmond by the collar and slammed against the glass wall so hard it shuddered in its frame. Do not, Julian said very softly, ever speak to her like that again. He released Desmond, who slid down the glass coughing, and turned back to Maren as if nothing had happened, his voice gentling by several degrees. You know who diverted it. Maren looked at Desmond gasping on the floor, and understood there was no version of tonight where she walked away untouched by this world. Lie. And Julian would know. Tell the truth, and she was choosing a side in a war she hadn't started. There's a dummy entity, she said. Hallworth Advisory. Desmond's been running it 8 months. I have the proof on an encrypted drive. Julian's mouth curved. Not amusement, something closer to recognition. Like he'd just found something he'd been missing without knowing it was missing. Ray, he said without breaking eye contact with Maren. One of the men stepped forward. Take Mr. Ashcombe for a drive. Have a long talk about Hallworth Advisory. Then to Maren. Pack nothing. You don't work for this firm anymore. You work for me. No, I don't work for the mob. He reached out, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that didn't match anything else about him. Electricity went straight down her spine. You do now, he said, and you are going to be safe. That is not negotiable. She ran the moment his back was turned. Straight down 39 flights of stairs, her lungs burning long before she hit the lobby, her heels slapping concrete in a stairwell that smelled like bleach and old cigarettes. She burst out onto the street into a wall of cold air and flagged the first cab she saw, giving the driver an address 3 blocks from her actual apartment out of a paranoia she didn't fully understand yet but trusted completely. She didn't know yet that her old life was already ash. She only knew that a man who dismantled crime families with his bare hands had looked at her like she was something to be kept, not endured, and that the look had frightened her far more than anything Desmond Ashcombe had ever said to her in 6 years of quiet cruelty. Fear, she was learning tonight, came in more than one flavor. Some of it tasted like a gun in a stranger's hand. Some of it tasted like being wanted by exactly the wrong person, in exactly the right way. She let herself into the building, took the stairs 2 at a time, and didn't stop shaking until the deadbolt and the chain were both thrown. Then she stood with her back against the door and let herself cry for exactly 40 seconds, because that was all the time she thought she could afford, before she pushed off the door and went to find the duffel bag in her closet. She made it up to her apartment, bolted the door, and had a duffel bag half packed. She was thinking Canada. She was thinking anywhere, when the front door splintered inward. Not Julian's men. These moved wrong, sloppy, urgent, cursing. Find her. Find the drive. Ashcombe wants it clean. Desmond. He'd made a call before Ray got to him. She backed into the corner of her bedroom, grabbed the only heavy object in reach, a ceramic lamp, and held it like it would do anything at all against the gun the first man through the door was already raising. "Big girl," he said, almost admiring, "but not big enough. Hand over the drive and I'll make it quick." The window behind him exploded first, a spray of glass like thrown diamonds, and then 3 flat, pressed shots cracked the air before either man could turn. Both dropped where they stood. Julian stepped through the ruined window frame like the violence hadn't touched him at all, sleeves shoved up, a pistol still smoking loosely in one hand. His eyes found her huddled in the corner, and something in his face, fury, then a flood of relief so raw it looked almost like pain, rearranged itself completely. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees in front of her, not caring about the glass. "Are you hurt?" His hands framed her face, checking. "Did they touch you? You killed them?" "They came to kill you." His jaw was iron. Ashcombe made a call he shouldn't have lived long enough to make. "That's the last mistake he'll get." "You don't even know me," Maren whispered. "I know you looked a monster in the eye today and didn't flinch." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "In a room full of cowards, you were the only real thing in it." He stood, and before she could argue, he had scooped her up like she weighed nothing at all. She gasped, grabbing his shoulders on instinct. "Put me down, I'm too." "You are exactly the right amount," he said, already carrying her toward the door, stepping over the bodies without a glance. "Ray, burn this." Gas leak. Erase her file from every system in the city. "Wait, my whole life is here." "Your life was here," Julian said, quiet and absolute, carrying her down the stairwell into the night. "It almost got you killed because the people around you were too small to see what you're worth. From tonight, you belong to no one but yourself. And I intend to make very sure nothing ever touches you again." The helicopter cut across black water toward a compound lit up like a small, private country. Maren gripped the armrest hard enough to whiten her knuckles the entire flight, aware the whole time of Julian watching her instead of the view. "You're cutting off your own circulation," he said through the headset. "You kidnapped me. I relocated you." A faint, dangerous smile. "Kidnapping implies a ransom. There isn't enough money on this planet to make me give you back." The estate swallowed her whole the moment the helicopter's rotors wound down. Floodlights ringed the property in a perimeter so bright it turned the surrounding pines a flat, unnatural silver, and armed men moved along the tree line with the unhurried patrol pattern of soldiers, not security guards. Inside, the foyer opened into vaulted ceilings and imported marble, the kind of quiet, absolute wealth that didn't need to announce itself because everyone who mattered already knew. Staff stood at careful intervals along the hall, eyes fixed respectfully on the floor as she passed, and a silver-haired man in an immaculate 3-piece suit. Corwin, the house manager, she would learn, fell into step beside Julian and reported perimeter status like a general briefing a commanding officer. "East wing is secure, sir. Wardrobe's been stocked to your specifications." Her exact specifications. Julian had studied her, size and all, before she'd even agreed to stay. Dinner was set for 2 at one end of a table built for 30. Braised short rib, fresh bread, the kind of food Maren hadn't let herself want in years. She sat with her hands folded, staring at the plate, the old shame closing over her throat. Julian set down his fork. The sound cracked across the silence. "Why aren't you eating?" "I'm not hungry." "Don't lie to me." His eyes were steady on her face. "Not to me. Ever. People have things to say when I eat," she said finally. hating how small it made her feel to admit it. Something dangerous moved behind his expression. Who? It's not. It's just how people are. Give me a name, he said, and I will make sure they never say it to anyone again. Julian, stop. You can't just... He covered her trembling hand with his, thumb tracing slow circles over her knuckles until her breath came easier. You've spent your whole life apologizing for the space you take up. I'm not going to be one more person who makes you do that. He tore a piece of bread, dipped it, and held it to her lips. Eat. Nobody in this house will ever make you feel small again. She ate. It was the best thing she had tasted in years, and not because of the bread. They talked, after that, in a way Maren hadn't talked to anyone in longer than she could remember. Julian asked her questions like the answers actually mattered. What she'd studied, why numbers had always made more sense to her than people, whether she missed the ocean she'd grown up 3 hours from, and never once visited as an adult because there had never been anyone to go with. He didn't perform interest the way men at office holiday parties sometimes did, running out of questions after 2. He listened like he was filing every answer away somewhere permanent. You don't talk like a man who launders money for a living, she said finally, emboldened by the wine and the warmth of the room. I don't launder anything, Julian said, mild as still water. I own the systems other men are foolish enough to try to launder through. There's a difference, even if the law doesn't see it that way. He turned his glass slowly by the stem. You'll find, if you stay, that I have very particular rules about who gets to hurt people and why. Most of the men who work for me learn them the easy way. Ashcombe's about to learn them the hard way. And me? What are the rules for me? Something shifted behind his eyes, dark and immediate. There are no rules for you, Maren. You're the exception every rule in this house was written around. He reached across the space between them and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the same unhurried gentleness from the conference room, and she felt it everywhere at once. Finish your plate, then I'll show you where you're sleeping. Morning light through heavy drapes. Maren woke tangled in sheets softer than anything she'd owned, momentarily unmoored before the previous night crashed back in. The closet Corwin had mentioned was full, not shapeless things meant to hide her, but tailored pieces built to her actual measurements, cut to flatter rather than conceal. There were cashmere sweaters in deep jewel tones she never would have picked for herself, wide-leg trousers that skimmed rather than squeezed, a row of silk blouses in her exact size that must have taken someone hours of careful, deliberate measuring to get right. Julian hadn't just bought her clothes. He'd studied her, the true shape of her, not the shape she usually tried to disappear inside. And then he'd built a wardrobe to meet that shape halfway. She dressed slowly, feeling strange and almost weightless in fabric that didn't fight her, and told herself the unfamiliar looseness in her chest was just relief at being alive. She didn't quite believe herself. There was a mirror at the end of the closet, full length, gilt-framed, the kind of mirror she would normally have avoided on instinct, and she caught herself standing in front of it a full minute longer than she meant to, turning slightly one way and then the other, looking at a woman who, for once, didn't look like she was apologizing for anything at all. 2 armed guards fell into step 10 paces behind her the moment she left her room, silent and unbothered, as if escorting hostages through marble hallways were simply part of the morning routine at the Vane estate. Perhaps, she thought, it was. She found him 3 floors below the house, in a command center walled in monitors, shipping lanes, market feeds, security grids. Mid-sentence in rapid, clipped Italian on a satellite line. He ended the call the moment she walked in. Sleep well? As well as a hostage can. That earned the ghost of a smile. Your aunt in Ohio received a wire and a notarized letter this morning explaining your sudden transfer to an overseas auditing contract. She won't worry. He poured her espresso from a machine that looked like it belonged in a hospital. As for you, I didn't bring you here only to keep you safe. I brought you here because I need what's in your head. He gestured to a workstation with 4 curved monitors. The complete financial architecture of the Renard family. East Coast rivals. They run a proprietary encryption scheme my people have been trying to break for half a year. They've failed. And you think I can do it? You cracked Ashcombe's firewall, a $10 million security system, while eating a granola bar at your desk. His mouth twitched. I know you can. The challenge was intoxicating in a way nothing at Ashcombe at Pierce had ever been. For years she'd been handed scraps to keep her quiet. Now she was being handed the whole board. If I do this, she said, not looking up from the screen, what do I get? Anything, Julian said. Name it. My freedom. His jaw tightened, something possessive and immovable flaring behind his eyes. I'll give you wealth. Protection. The whole of this city if you want it. But you will never leave me. Ask for something else. She didn't answer. She turned back to the screen instead, and for the next 2 weeks the command center became her entire world. Julian brought her meals himself. He refused to let her skip a single one. He rubbed the knots from her shoulders during the long nights, a comfort she came to crave despite every warning bell in her head. The Renard encryption turned out to be beautiful, in the way only something built by a genuinely careful person could be. Layered custody chains, rotating keys, dummy transaction noise designed to exhaust anyone who didn't know exactly what they were hunting for. Most analysts would have drowned in the noise. Maren didn't look for the transactions. She looked for the absences. The places where the noise pattern broke rhythm for a fraction of a second, the way a heartbeat skips before an arrhythmia. She mapped 400 shell accounts across 9 jurisdictions in 11 days, sleeping in 2-hour intervals on the leather couch in the corner while Julian brought her coffee, and, twice, physically pried her hands off the keyboard to make her rest. On the 15th night, she finally cracked the Renard core ledger and found something that stopped her cold. A $50 million structured payout wasn't going to a cartel or a bought judge. It was coming back into Julian's own organization, into a holding company controlled by his own second-in-command. His brother, Julian Vane. Maren shoved back from the desk, heart hammering, just as the steel door clicked shut behind her. She hadn't heard Adrian come in, hadn't heard anything over the roar of her own pulse and the soft mechanical hum of the servers, and by the time she registered the click of the lock, it was already far too late to pretend she hadn't seen what was on her screen. She thought, absurdly, of Desmond's conference room, of the sound the glass had made when Julian slammed him against it. She thought that sound might be the last thing standing between her and whatever came next, and that it was 3 floors and a locked door away. He looked like Julian. Same sharp bones, same dark hair, but his eyes were empty in a way Julian's never were. A suppressed pistol hung loose in his hand. "Clever girl," Adrian said, almost fond. "Too clever. I told him it was a mistake, bringing an outsider into the family. A fat little accountant playing with grown men's money. You're the leak." Her voice barely shook. "You're selling him out to the Renards. Business." He raised the gun. "Julian's gone soft, chasing you around instead of running this family. Once you're gone, I'll tell him it was federal surveillance. He'll grieve. He'll recover. And I'll finally run things the way they should be run." The reinforced door groaned, then blew inward on a charge that filled the room with smoke and concrete dust. Julian came through the wreckage like something summoned rather than arrived. Adrian barely had time to turn before 3 shots dropped him where he stood. Julian didn't look at his brother's body. He crossed to Maren and crushed her against him, shaking with an adrenaline that had nowhere left to go. "Are you hurt? Look at me. Did he touch you?" "No. He didn't fire. You got him in time." Julian pressed his mouth to her hair, breathing her in like oxygen, and looked down at Adrian with an expression scrubbed clean of anything resembling grief. "Nobody touches what's mine," he said. "Not enemies, not blood. Nobody." Corwin and Ray arrived within the minute, already moving to clear the room with the practiced, unhurried efficiency of men who had done this before and would do it again. Neither of them looked at Adrian's body longer than necessary. Neither of them looked at Maren with anything but a careful, deliberate blankness that she understood, somehow, as its own kind of respect. An acknowledgement that whatever she had just witnessed was hers to carry, and none of their business to comment on. "Clean it up," Julian said, his voice utterly flat. "Full lockdown. If Adrian was feeding Renard our schedules, assume the perimeter's compromised until I say otherwise." Maren stood in the circle of his arm, staring at the ruined door, at the smoke still curling from the blast site, and felt something settle into place inside her that she didn't have a name for yet. She had spent her whole life trying to take up less room, folding herself smaller in chairs built for smaller people, apologizing with her whole body for the simple fact of existing in it. And here was a man who had just executed his own brother without a flicker of hesitation, for no better reason than that his brother had pointed a gun at her. She understood, distantly, that she should be afraid of a man capable of that. She understood, more immediately, that she wasn't. Maren pulled back from him sooner than he wanted, already thinking, "I need the console." "Absolutely not. You're in shock." "Julian, listen." Adrian was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. If he planned to disappear me and take over, he built himself an exit. He was a systems man. There's a failsafe somewhere. Corwin, hovering near the ruined door, went still. "She might be right, sir. Adrian handled our encrypted lines with the Renards personally." Julian's jaw worked, but he stepped aside. 10 minutes. Then I'm carrying you upstairs myself." 5 minutes into decrypting Adrian's private partition, the screen pulsed an ugly amber. "Found it," Maren breathed. A dead man trigger tied to his vitals monitor. The second his heart stopped, it executed. "What did it do?" "Drop the firewall on your Swiss accounts. But that's cover. The real payload broadcast this estate's exact coordinates and gate codes straight to Renard's private server. And it pinged an FBI contact, Agent Ren Harlan. Harlan's been on Renard's payroll for years, Julian said, a curse following in Italian. Adrian just handed them my front door. The compound's alarm shattered the quiet a heartbeat later. A deafening mechanical shriek that seemed to vibrate up through the floor itself. Corwin's radio crackled to life with a burst of static and clipped, urgent voices. Armed tactical teams advancing through the tree line, gates already breached, numbers still being counted. Julian gripped her face in both hands. Corwin takes you to the vault, foot-thick titanium. You lock it and you don't open it for anyone but my voice. No. He blinked, genuinely thrown. This isn't a negotiation, Maren. If you lock me in a box, you lose your only advantage. Her mind was already 10 steps ahead, the way it always was under pressure. Renard thinks your accounts are frozen and your walls are down. He doesn't know I still have a backdoor into his own blockchain from last week. Give me 20 minutes. I'll spoof Harlan's own credentials, flag every Renard offshore account for terrorism financing, and let the SWIFT network do what it does automatically. I'll bankrupt him from the inside while your men hold the ground. Julian stared at her. Not fear, not doubt. Something closer to awe. Corwin, arm the perimeter. Get me the rifles. He pulled her into one hard, desperate kiss. Burn them down, my queen. Gunfire rolled across the lawn like weather, a rolling percussion that made the floorboards hum under Maren's chair. On the bank of monitors, the thermal cameras painted the grounds in ghostly orange and blue. A dozen shapes advancing from the tree line, another dozen falling back from the house to meet them, and one shape, taller than the rest, moving through the exchange with an economy of motion that looked less like combat and more like inevitability. Maren forced herself not to watch the thermal feed too long. Julian moving through the chaos like something the bullets simply hadn't caught up to yet, and turned back to her screens. Her hands found the keyboard on muscle memory alone, because if she let herself think too hard about what was happening 30 yards from where she sat, her fingers would stop working entirely, and 30 yards was the only distance that mattered right now. She routed through the Fed's secondary systems using an exploit she'd built years ago and sworn never to use, spoofed Harlan's authorization tier, and pulled up every account tied to Renard's empire. 50 accounts. $3 billion. She split it into 10,000 microtransactions and routed them, in a blink, through accounts flagged for terror financing before the funds vanished into an irreversible cryptographic void. Execute. Her finger hovered, then hit the key. The terminal froze for 5 endless seconds. Then green confirmations flooded every screen at once. Corwin's radio crackled with intercepted chatter. Command. Our comms are dying. HQ says the feds just hit the New York accounts. Funding's gone. Contracts are void. Abort. Abort. On the thermal feed, the tide broke instantly. Mercenaries loyal to a paycheck, not a man, scrambled back toward their vehicles the moment the paycheck disappeared. 10 minutes later, the steel door groaned open. Julian stood in the frame, soot-streaked, a shallow gash bleeding at his temple, eyes lit with something fierce and triumphant. He crossed to her in 3 strides and pulled her against him, uncaring of the blood or the dust. It's done, she whispered into his shoulder. Renard's broke. The feds are on his properties right now. He framed her face in both hands, looking at her the way no one ever had, like she was the whole point of the room. You didn't just save my life tonight, you handed me the entire eastern seaboard. His thumb traced her jaw. You are the most brilliant, dangerous thing I have ever found. I don't want to disappear again, she said. I don't want to be a secret. You won't be. His voice dropped low and certain. Tomorrow I'm taking you to the best tailor in this city. And then I'm buying out the Wren Hotel ballroom. And every politician and rat who matters is going to watch me put a ring on your hand heavy enough to mean something. They will know exactly who you are. She smiled, slow, sure, nothing at all like the woman who used to shrink into cardigans to disappear. She pulled him down by his ruined collar and kissed him like an equal, not a rescue. The invisible auditor was gone. In her place stood the only person in this city who had ever made the numbers, and the men who lived by them, Neil. 3 weeks later, the ballroom of the Wren Hotel was lit gold from end to end, and every person who mattered in the city's underworld and half its city hall had shown up because they'd been told, in no uncertain terms, that showing up was not optional. Maren stood at the top of the marble staircase in a dress the tailor on the mile had built around her, rather than in spite of her. Deep emerald silk, cut close through the waist and generous through the hip, nothing about it apologizing for a single inch of her. 6 months ago she would have died before wearing something this unwilling to hide. Tonight she felt, for the first time in her adult life, entirely at home in her own skin. Julian waited for her at the bottom of the stairs in a black suit that made him look less like a man and more like a verdict. He didn't smile the easy, practiced smile he gave rooms full of strangers. He watched her come down the stairs the way he'd watched her from the very first day. like she was the only fixed point in a moving world. "You're staring," she said when she reached him. "I intend to keep doing that for the rest of my life," he said, and lifted her hand to his mouth. "Every person in this room is about to learn exactly whose you are, and exactly what happens to anyone foolish enough to forget it." Corwin appeared at Julian's elbow long enough to murmur that the mayor's chief of staff and 2 city councilmen had already arrived, trailed at a careful distance by men whose suits didn't quite disguise the shape of what they were carrying. Julian nodded him off without looking away from Maren. "You didn't have to buy out the entire hotel," she said. "I didn't do it for the hotel." He drew her hand through his arm and turned them both toward the ballroom doors, where 200 of the city's most dangerous and most powerful people were waiting to be told, without a word needing to be said aloud, that the woman on his arm was not a guest of the Vane family. She was the reason it still had a future. She caught sight of a few familiar faces as they crossed the room. A city councilman who had once looked straight through her at a compliance hearing without registering she was a person, now watching her with the wary, calculating attention people reserved for someone whose favor might matter someday. It was, she thought, a strange kind of justice, to be seen at last not despite her size or her history, but simply because of who now stood beside her. Though she suspected, if she stayed in this world long enough, she would come to be seen for exactly who she was on her own, ledger or no ledger, ring or no ring. Somewhere behind them, a quartet began to play. Julian leaned down, his mouth close to her ear. "Ready, Ms. Doyle?" Maren thought of the fluorescent lights on the 40th floor, the granola bar she used to eat alone at her desk, the version of herself who used to fold her hands in her lap and apologize with her whole body for existing in a room. She thought of all of it, and let it go. "I was born ready," she said, and walked through the doors on the arm of the most dangerous man in the city, exactly as visible as she had always deserved to be. If you loved Maren and Julian's story, the slow burn, the danger, the woman who finally stopped shrinking, stay close for more high-stakes romance coming soon.